so few shows that are on the air that do 22 episodes that go and go and go and go. So we're just blessed. We're so grateful.
What if the most important part of the Ryan Reynolds, Blake Lively, and Justin Baldoni story isn't the controversy people are reacting to, but the timeline behind it that keeps being overlooked? In recent weeks, this situation has been described in many different ways. Some call it a controversy, others use much stronger language, but labels on their own don't explain very much, especially when multiple names, projects, and public narratives begin overlapping. What makes this moment stand out is how many familiar threads are intersecting at the same time. Ryan Reynolds has re-entered the conversation through a separate workplace issue. Blake Lively's ongoing legal situation continues to shape how events are perceived. And Justin Baldoni, along with the production environment surrounding it, ends with Us and Wayfarer Studios, remains part of the broader context, whether or not he is directly tied to the latest headline. This isn't about adding another opinion or deciding who is right or wrong. Instead, it's about examining how the story unfolded, how attention was drawn to certain moments, how explanations followed, and how the framing of events may have shifted before the full sequence was ever examined. When stories move this quickly, the most important details are often the ones that get skipped. Once the timeline is slowed down, a different picture begins to emerge. The renewed attention didn't start loudly, but it escalated fast. It began with a workplace issue connected to Ryan Reynolds, separate from any courtroom filing, and outside the production of It Ends With Us itself. What captured attention wasn't only the incident, but the speed at which it traveled from a contained situation into a broader public discussion about responsibility, authority, and timing. As coverage spread, familiar patterns returned. Early reactions leaned toward reassurance. Statements focused on intent, and context arrived quickly. Before the full sequence of events was widely understood, the conversation began drifting toward resolution. That speed matters. In situations like this, the first framing often becomes the default lens through which everything else is viewed. Once that lens is set, later details are filtered through it, sometimes fairly, sometimes not. The result isn't necessarily misinformation, but compression. Complexity gets reduced in favor of clarity, and nuance is lost along the way. This is where Blake Lively's ongoing legal situation becomes relevant. Not because the events are the same, but because public perception doesn't reset between stories. When multiple controversies involve the same circle of people, earlier narratives influence how new ones are received. Expectations carry over. The same applies to Justin Baldoni and the professional environment connected to It Ends With Us and Wayfarer Studios. Even when he isn't directly involved in the latest headline, his role within that broader ecosystem keeps earlier discussions in view. Production dynamics, public-facing responsibilities, and media attention don't exist in isolation. What stood out in this initial flashpoint wasn't a single claim or response, but the rhythm of events. Scrutiny surfaced, explanations followed quickly, and the conversation moved forward before the timeline was fully unpacked. That doesn't mean those explanations were wrong, it means they arrived early. And when explanations come before sequence, they shape which questions feel reasonable to ask next. Instead of asking what happened first, attention shifts to what it means. Instead of examining how decisions were made, the focus turns to how they should be interpreted. This is how stories accelerate, and how important details can be left behind without anyone intending to leave them there. Once the narrative moves on, catching up to the timeline becomes harder. That's why the next step isn't reacting to the explanation. It's slowing down and looking at the order of events that led there in the first place. Slowing everything down reveals how the narrative shifted before the order of events was fully clear. Once attention settled on the initial flashpoint, the story didn't pause, it pivoted. After the first surge of coverage, the conversation began to change shape, moving away from what actually unfolded first and toward how the situation should be understood. That shift didn't happen instantly, but it followed a familiar pattern. Explanation arriving before examination. Media coverage played a central role in this transition. Early reporting emphasized reassurance and interpretation, often foregrounding statements and summaries rather than chronology. The moment was framed as content, an issue acknowledged, addressed, and ready to move past. That framing didn't deny complexity, but it placed it behind the promise of resolution. This is where context quietly does more work than facts. Context guides interpretation, and when it arrives early, it sets expectations about what matters most. Instead of asking what happened first, audiences are encouraged to ask how they should feel about it. Instead of tracking steps, they're offered meaning. As that framing took hold, the story widened. Connections were drawn and comparisons surfaced. Public discussion began referencing Blake Lively's ongoing legal situation not as a separate event, but as part of a shared atmosphere of scrutiny. When the same names recur in headlines, boundaries between distinct situations become easier to blur. That blurring isn't intentional, but it is influential. At the same time, the production environment surrounding It Ends With Us and Wayfarer Studios remained in the background, even when Justin Baldoni wasn't central to the latest coverage. His role within that ecosystem kept earlier debates close at hand. For viewers, the narrative became less about a single incident and more about an emerging pattern. What stands out is how quickly the emphasis shifted from sequence to interpretation. The question stopped being what actually unfolded and became how it fit into a broader story. Once that broader story takes shape, individual details lose urgency. This doesn't mean the coverage was inaccurate. It means it was selective, prioritizing clarity over chronology. And when clarity arrives first, chronology struggles to reclaim space later. That's how narratives stabilize even while questions remain unresolved. Once the framing settled, the only way to test it was to step back and slow everything down. Not to reinterpret the story, but to place each moment in order and see what still held once the sequence was visible. This is where the timeline becomes essential. The public conversation began with reaction. Attention surged, statements followed, explanations were offered. But when those elements are reordered chronologically, a different structure emerges, one where response often precedes clarity and meaning arrives before detail. That order doesn't invalidate the explanations, but it does reframe them. In situations involving high-profile figures like Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively, the pace of response is driven by visibility. Public attention demands quick framing, and quick framing favors interpretation over documentation. Timelines, however, are indifferent to urgency. They simply show what happened and when the sequence is slowed. Certain gaps become easier to notice, not dramatic omissions, but quiet intervals where context was provided before underlying steps were fully described. Moments where the conversation advanced while specifics remained unresolved. This is also where the broader production context comes back into focus. The environment around it ends with us, and Wayfarer Studios operates through layered roles: creative authority, public representation, internal oversight. When scrutiny arises, those layers don't surface at the same time, and that misalignment matters. Once timelines are examined, responsibility stops being abstract and becomes tied to sequence: who acted first, who responded next, and who was positioned to explain what happened. In that structure, early framing is no longer the starting point. It becomes one moment among many. For Justin Baldoni, this distinction is especially important. His involvement remains connected to the production ecosystem rather than the most recent headline itself. A chronological view clarifies which moments relate to his role and which do not, reducing assumptions that form when stories overlap without sequence. Timelines don't accuse or defend, they narrow the range of interpretations that remain plausible once every step is visible. And as that narrowing begins, the story becomes less flexible, even as it grows clearer. Once the timeline is laid out, attention naturally shifts from individual moments to the system they came from. Stories like this rarely belong to one person or one decision. They move through an ecosystem of interconnected roles, responsibilities, and public-facing expectations. In this case, that ecosystem includes It Ends With Us, Wayfarer Studios, and the broader creative and promotional machinery surrounding the project. Film productions don't operate under a single line of authority. They involve producers, directors, talent, studios, and marketing teams, each with responsibilities that don't always surface simultaneously. As public discussion widened, secondary figures entered the conversation not because of new actions, but because of proximity to the project. Names like Brandon Sklenar and Colleen Hoover appeared more frequently, not as central drivers of controversy, but as part of the wider context audiences were trying to understand. Their presence highlighted how quickly attention expands beyond the initial flow.
Amazing. So you, of course, are handing out toys. How is it going?
It's going fantastic. I mean, you get to hand out toys to kids who might not.
That expansion can create confusion, encouraging assumptions of shared decision-making where none existed, and blurring distinctions between creative roles and public representation. This is why understanding the production environment matters more than focusing on any single reaction. Figures like Paul Feig are relevant, not due to direct involvement in the latest controversy, but because they represent the broader industry framework these projects sit within. Their presence reminds audiences that productions operate through established processes, even when those processes aren't immediately visible in public narratives. Once the ecosystem is perceived as a whole, actions by one part can be interpreted as reflective of the entire system, fairly or not, and that perception shapes how explanations are received. What gets lost in this expansion is precision. Instead of asking who made which decision and when, the conversation drifts toward general impressions. The story becomes about an environment rather than a sequence. While environments provide context, they can also blur accountability if timelines aren't kept in view. That's why returning to structure becomes essential as more names enter the frame. Because once the ecosystem expands this far, the question is no longer who is connected, but how responsibility is actually distributed. As responsibility begins to blur, repetition becomes easier to spot. The story stops feeling like isolated moments and starts to resemble a pattern not of intent or behavior, but of response. Attention rises, explanations follow, and the conversation is nudged forward in a familiar rhythm. And it's at this stage that comparison becomes unavoidable across situations involving Ryan Reynolds, Blake Lively, and the production environment tied to It Ends With Us. The sequence has often followed a familiar rhythm. scrutiny appears, media attention follows, context is introduced early, and before the full order of events is widely understood, the narrative begins to stabilize around reassurance. This rhythm doesn't require coordination. It emerges naturally in high-profile environments where public perception carries real consequences. The pressure to contain uncertainty is strong, and early framing can feel like a necessary step to prevent speculation from filling the gaps. But repetition changes how that framing is received. When audiences encounter the same pattern more than once, their focus shifts from evaluating individual explanations to evaluating the pattern itself. The question quietly changes from, is this explanation reasonable, to why does this explanation always arrive at this point? That subtle shift is powerful. It also shapes how secondary figures are perceived. Names like Brandon Sklenar or Colleen Hoover, when mentioned within the same ecosystem, are interpreted through the lens of prior moments. Even neutral actions take on added weight once patterns are established. This is how trust becomes conditional, not because the facts have changed, but because familiarity alters expectations. Viewers start anticipating the next phase of the response cycle, and explanations are no longer evaluated in isolation. They are compared against a growing archive of past reactions. Patterns alone don't prove anything, but they narrow the interpretations that feel plausible. They make certain narratives harder to accept without deeper scrutiny and raise the threshold for reassurance. At this stage, momentum may appear to slow, but in reality, the story is consolidating. It's no longer expanding outward, it's looping back on itself, testing whether the same response can maintain credibility. When patterns repeat, the question is no longer what explanation comes next, but has the pattern itself become the story? Eventually, stories stop being debated and begin being measured. As patterns become visible, attention naturally shifts from interpretation to process, where narrative influence diminishes not because it disappears, but because it is no longer sufficient on its own. In creative environments tied to projects like It Ends With Us and companies such as Wayfarer Studios, outcomes are shaped by structure, who holds authority, how decisions are approved, and when those steps occurred. Once scrutiny reaches this phase, explanations are evaluated not for how reassuring they sound, but for how well they align with documented sequence. This transition is quiet but significant. For Ryan Reynolds, whose involvement stemmed from a separate workplace issue, relevance shifts from visibility to proximity to decision-making. For Blake Lively, earlier framing is now read alongside procedural questions about roles and responsibility. For Justin Baldoni, whose connection remains rooted in the production ecosystem, process clarifies the boundaries of his involvement. Once attention moves into this territory, momentum changes. Statements slow. Public-facing explanations become more careful. Focus narrows to what can be verified rather than what can be interpreted. This often gives the impression that the story is losing steam, but in reality, it is entering a phase where outcomes are determined less by attention and more by alignment. Process does not respond to urgency, it responds to consistency. Early choices become reference points, later explanations are measured against them, and even small inconsistencies carry weight. The conversation shifts inward toward structure, documentation, and sequence. Narratives stop evolving freely. They are constrained by what can be supported. After process takes center stage, what isn't said becomes as meaningful as what is. Updates grow less frequent, language more measured, and the space once occupied by framing is replaced with restraint. Outside observers may interpret this quiet as the story winding down, but it is actually entering a consequential phase. Silence here is not absence. It is caution. Each explanation must align with prior statements, timelines, documentation, and defined roles. In this environment, restraint preserves consistency rather than signaling disengagement. This dynamic is visible across the interconnected situations involving Ryan Reynolds, Blake Lively, and the broader It Ends With Us production. Early responses give way to quieter intervals where public communication narrows and attention shifts toward internal review rather than outward narrative. When people stop offering broad interpretations, it often indicates that the margin for interpretation has shrunk. The conversation moves from shaping perception to maintaining alignment. Secondary figures are affected as well. Names like Brandon Sklenar and Colleen Hoover remain visible, but their role changes. They become reference points defined by proximity, not action. Silence around them does not imply guilt. It signals caution within a shared ecosystem. Over time, patterns of restraint become as recognizable as earlier patterns of response. Viewers noticed when updates stall at similar points across different situations. Once this pattern emerges, silence ceases to feel neutral. It becomes part of the story's structure, a signal rather than a conclusion. At this stage, two parallel tracks are evident. One is the public conversation, shaped by headlines, reactions, and commentary. The other moves quietly, guided by review processes that don't accelerate with attention. This split is critical. When scrutiny shifts inward toward internal evaluation, documentation, or procedural review, standards change. What matters is no longer how convincing a narrative sounds, but whether it aligns with sequence, defined roles, and recorded decisions. These processes do not operate on news cycles. nor do they speed up because public attention spikes. This is where tension emerges between perception and outcome, between narrative and the underlying process that ultimately determines what can be sustained,
And Will, who we meet early on in the film, also has cystic fibrosis, but has a pretty rare bacteria, which
The public may feel certainty long before any review reaches a conclusion. Headlines can suggest momentum, while the underlying process remains methodical and unresolved. That disconnect often creates confusion, especially when updates slow or stop altogether. In the context of It Ends With Us and Wayfarer Studios, this distinction is particularly important. Productions operate under layered oversight, and reviews often involve multiple stages that aren't visible externally. Public conversation can move far ahead of what is actually being evaluated. For Justin Baldoni, whose role remains tied to the production environment, this split explains why visibility doesn't equal involvement at every stage of scrutiny. For secondary figures like Brandon Sklenar and Colleen Hoover, it clarifies why public attention does not always translate into procedural relevance. The key takeaway isn't that one track is more important than the other, it's that they do not move together. When public perception and formal review diverge, expectations based on headlines often fail to match eventual outcomes. In these cases, the question isn't which dominates the moment, it's which ultimately defines what remains on record once the public conversation moves on. As attention fades, the story doesn't disappear. It condenses. The wide range of speculation, reaction, and interpretation gives way to a smaller set of unresolved points that continue to matter, precisely because they have not been answered. This is where outcomes quietly take shape. In situations involving Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively, the shift is subtle but significant. Early coverage touched on a wide array of themes: public reaction, workplace dynamics, media framing. Now, the focus narrows to precise questions tied to sequence and responsibility. With fewer questions in play, each carries more weight. Explanations are no longer evaluated on tone or immediacy. They are measured against consistency. Statements made early are revisited alongside later clarifications, and gaps that once seemed minor become more visible as the narrative tightens. This is also where proximity matters more than visibility. For Justin Baldoni, whose involvement remains anchored to the production context, narrowing clarifies which aspects of the story are relevant to his role and which are not. The same applies to secondary figures like Brandon Sklenar and Colleen Hoover. As the story contracts, their relevance is no longer assumed. It is defined by documented connection to specific moments rather than by association with the broader conversation. What remains is a quieter version of the story, but one that is harder to reshape. With fewer elements in play, unresolved details become more durable, leaving less room for reframing and more emphasis on alignment. This phase often gives the impression that public interest has stalled. In reality, the story is settling into a form that won't change, not because answers have been reached, but because the remaining questions resist simplification. Once a story reaches this point, it no longer expands. The final question is no longer what drew attention initially, but what remains unresolved once everything else has fallen away. At this stage, the conversation is no longer driven by attention or reaction. What determines how the story settles is not who speaks the loudest or which narrative gained traction first, but what remains consistent when examined against structure. For situations involving Ryan Reynolds, Blake Lively, and the professional environment around It Ends With Us and Wayfarer Studios, the deciding factors narrow to a few core elements: documented sequence, defined roles, and how earlier explanations align with what can be supported over time. These factors may seem procedural, but they are decisive. Early framing does not disappear. It becomes part of the record. Statements made during the initial response phase are revisited not for tone, but for durability. When timelines are compared and responsibilities clarified, explanations are tested against consistency rather than intent. What holds together remains, what does not quietly falls away. Proximity again becomes more important than visibility. For Justin Baldoni, whose involvement remains rooted in the production context rather than the latest headline, evaluation centers on role clarity and sequence. For Blake Lively, earlier narratives are weighed against the full arc of events. For Ryan Reynolds, relevance is measured by where decisions intersected with responsibility. Secondary figures like Brandon Sklenar and Colleen Hoover are no longer assessed broadly. Their relevance is narrowly tied to documented connections rather than association. The story has little room for inference. What remains is a version of events defined by alignment between what was said, when it was said, and what the sequence allows to remain credible. Resolution often feels quiet. By the time it arrives, most of the work has already been done beneath the surface. Outcomes do not announce themselves, they settle because, once determined this way, the final question is not who controlled the narrative, but what version of the story can actually stand when structure is all that remains. Public attention can be loud, and narratives can appear complete, even while the underlying process continues quietly. What connects the situations involving Ryan Reynolds, Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, And the broader ecosystem is not a single moment or headline, it is the way framing takes hold quickly, while structure reveals what actually lasts slowly. Once timelines are laid out, roles clarified, and early explanations compared against later scrutiny, the story stops evolving on its own terms. What remains is not the loudest version of events, but the one that holds together when everything else is stripped away. Resolution rarely arrives dramatically. It arrives quietly, shaped by consistency rather than reaction, and by what survives careful examination rather